Chapter 9. The racket on the lower deck had grown even louder by the time John followed Mr. Torse, the master gunner, down to his new berth. Mr. Torse was small and moved neatly, like a cat, turning once or twice to check that John was following, and giving him each time an encouraging grin, which wrinkled his wizened face even more. Stepping over drunken sailors, avoiding dancing women, and ducking under low beams, Mr. Torse reached at last a canvas awning that separated the lower gun deck from the cramped space at the stern of the ship. He lifted this, and John followed him inside. Only a little light penetrated through the gun ports cut into the stern of the ship. Two great guns stood at these, their barrels pointing out to sea. The rest of the small space was crowded with casks and crates, boxes and chests. A lantern hung from a low beam, and, in the light it cast, John saw the faces of 4 boys turned towards him, and 4 pairs of eyes looking him up and down. "John," said Tom Todd, jumping up from the chest where he had been sitting, "are you going to mess with us?" "Mess? What mess?" John said, bewildered. A short, skinny boy, whose close-set eyes were watching John with no sign of friendliness, said with a sneering wonderment, "A little gentleman, a regular landlubber. Stupid too. I'm not about to give him the day with the likes of him." "Hold your adder's tongue, Nate Claypole," said Mr. Torse, cuffing him sharply round the head. "John Barr's to be your messmate. That means," he turned to John and emphasised each point with a stab of his forefinger, "you eats it, you sleeps it, and you works it, and you learns it. You're one of my lads now. That all means you'll do just what I say." He paused and added with a ferocious frown, "Even if I command you to put on a lady's dress and dance a hornpipe." John's eyes opened in alarm, and the other boys grinned. "Or climb the mainmast upside down and sing 'Come, loyal Britons, all rejoice,'" sang out Tom. "Most certainly," nodded Mr. Torse gravely. "Or jump overboard and drown yourself," muttered Nate, too low for anyone but John to hear. "Or," began the third boy, a heavily built young giant, whose brow was creased with the effort of thinking of something clever. "Or—" He stopped and shook his head, looking confused. "Whatever you say, Davy," said Mr. Torse, with a pat on the boy's shoulder. "Now, my young men, it's dinner time. And if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Jabez Barton is approaching with viands to delight you all." As he spoke, the canvas screen lifted, and the big-boned, fair-haired gunner's mate came in. He was carrying a wooden pail in one hand and a pile of loaves in the other. But what caught John's eye and made him stare was the brilliantly coloured parrot that was perched on the man's shoulder, lovingly nibbling his ear. And then the smell of hot salt beef stew hit his nose, and he realised he was hungry, desperately, ravenously hungry. The boys had scrambled to take their places on the sea chests which served as benches at the table. It was already set for a meal, with plates, mugs and spoons. John moved forward shyly and saw, properly, the first time, a 4th boy. He was slight, smaller than the others, with dark hair tied back in a pigtail. His dark, watchful eyes were wary. But as they met John's blue ones, the boy's face relaxed into a friendly smile. "I'm Kit," he said, "Mr. Torse's servant." There was a space beside Nate Claypole. John made to sit down, but Nate stuck out a sharp elbow and turned ostensibly away. Kit frowned at Nate and shifted up to make room for John. Gratefully, John slid into the place beside him. "One more boy, do I see?" the man with the parrot said, in a slow, West Country voice. "Bless me, there's boys coming up through the floor, and out the gun barrels. There's more of 'em every time I look." As he bent to set an extra plate, mug and spoon in front of John, the parrot squawked and flapped its wings, revealing a gorgeous flash of scarlet feathers, and a stream of green goo shot out from under its tail and landed on the table. "That's not nice, Horace. Not nice at all," said the gunner's mate reprovingly, taking off his greasy neckcloth and wiping up the mess. "Is that his name? Horace?" John dared to ask. "Aye. 'Tweren't me that gave him such a fancy name. 'Twas Mr. Erskine. 'That's a fine bird you have there, Jabez,' he says to me. 'What's his name?' So I says, 'Parrot, sir.' 'Parrot?' says he. 'What kind of a name is Parrot?' 'Call him Horace.' 'Aye, aye, sir,' I says. 'So Horace he be, and Horace he'll stay.'" He had already ladled out a generous portion of stew onto John's plate. John picked up his spoon, desperate to begin. But before he could take his first mouthful, Nate Claypool leaned across the table and pretended to slip, giving John's plate a hard shove. It would have shot down into his lap, spilling all its contents, if Kit hadn't quickly caught it. "Oh dear, oh my, what an accident," said Nate, looking round at the others as if hoping for their approval. But none of them looked back at him. He flushed and started to eat quickly, his left hand holding tightly onto his hunk of bread, as if he was afraid someone might snatch it from him. Mr. Torse and Jabez Barton, with several other members of the master gunner's crew, had settled themselves at another suspended table beside the second gun, leaving the boys to themselves. No one spoke as they ate their meal. Although the stew was too salty, the meat tough, and the loaf hard, John devoured his helping, and ran the last crust of bread round his platter again and again to soak up any remaining smear of gravy. He looked up when he finished, saw the other boys' eyes were on him. "Have you never been before to sea?" said Kit. There was a slight foreign lilt to his voice. "No," said John. "I never wanted to, either. My father was taken by the press gang yesterday, and I didn't have anywhere else to go, so I volunteered." "So where's your pa now, then?" said Tom. "He was sent to another ship. He's on the Splendid," John answered gruffly. "Oh, aye, the Splendid. Not a bad sea boat. Only 64 guns, though. We're a 74. Tom smirked with pride. "They told my father he used to be the captain's clerk." "The captain's clerk?" Nate said, nastily mimicking John's voice. "An officer! Mind your P's and Q's, boys. Mr. John's daddy's an officer." Tom turned on him. "Stow it, rat face. You're a spiteful toad." Nate took out a piece of cord and a pocket knife, turned his back on the others, and began to fiddle with them. "Is that your bundle, John?" said Kit. "Do you not have a desk to put your things in?" "You can share mine," said Tom. "Ain't no room in yours, Tom," said Davy. "No room to hide a cockleshell in there." "Have you been in my chest again, Davy gal?" demanded Tom angrily. "You made me a promise. No more rummaging. You said after last time—" "I never rummaged, Tom," Davy interrupted anxiously. "I just looked. I never took nothing. I just—" "What have you hidden in it, then?" said Tom, exasperated. "Only a little dead mousie," said Davy. "It had to go somewhere nice and warm." "You put a dead mouse in my chest? You great looby. Don't you know it'll rot and stink and infect all my gear?" "Smelled good yesterday," said Davy, hurt. "I found it while I was mucking out the hen cages. I thought you'd like it, Tom." Tom gave an exclamation of disgust, jumped up, manhandled Davy off the chest he was sitting on, and opened it. Holding his nose with one thumb and forefinger, he pulled out a dead mouse with his other hand and hurled it out through the gun port. "Don't you ever go putting things in my chest now. Mind it, Davy." Nate looked round and snorted. "You're wasting your breath. No telling that beef-witted bonehead anything. They ought to have dropped him overboard months ago." Kit leaned over to whisper in John's ear. "Davy fell from the rigging last year. He hit his head so bad. He was training to be a topman, one that works up with the highest sails. He didn't speak for a long time, and now his wits are all confused. He just looks after the hens and cows. Mr. Tor says he's getting better, though." He shook his head as if in disbelief, and spoke more loudly. "But it's true what Davy says, that Tom's chest is full. Mine's half empty. You can put your things in mine, John, if you like." He got up from the table and went across to a stack of long wooden cases that were lashed to the wall. John followed him. "What's in all of these?" he asked curiously. "Muskets, pistols, cutlasses," Kit said casually, "for when we go to battle stations." The word battle sent a shiver down John's spine. "Have you ever been in one? A battle?" "No, but if we're heading south towards France, we're sure to see action. It's 2 years since Trafalgar. We slammed the French Navy then, and Napoleon's still riding high in France and Spain. There's bound to be another battle soon." "Is that where we're going? To France or Spain?" Kit shrugged. "Tell us last of anyone." "I don't know. Thundering Sam's waiting on his orders." "Who's Thundering Sam?" "Oh, the captain. Captain Samuel Bannerman. Everyone calls him Thundering Sam. Because of his loud voice, I think." He thrust out his chin, opened his eyes wide, and deepened his high-pitched voice as low as it would go, and growled, "For king and country, lads! And the last man up the ratlines will be clapped in hands." John laughed. Kit's mimicry was so excellent, for a moment as if the captain had stood before him. "He's good, though, isn't he? A good captain, I mean." John remembered the rush of enthusiasm the captain's speech had sent coursing through him. He held his breath, willing Kit to say yes. "He's the best," Kit said simply. He had opened his chest now. There were a few spare clothes in it, a book half hidden under a cloth, and a bulging linen bag. "The bag," Kit said awkwardly, shuffling aside. "Just something of my mother's." "I won't touch it," John said quickly. He picked up his bundle and untied it. The purser's assistant had tidily folded his clothes before wrapping them up. He picked up his new shirt and trousers, ready to place them in the chest, and then stopped, startled. Lying between the layers of clothing, its straps folded neatly, was the satchel. "What is it? What's that?" asked Kit. "Oh, nothing. Just something of my father's," said John, putting the satchel quickly down into the chest. Following some obscure instinct, without knowing why, he hid it under a layer of clothes.